under Islamic socialist rule.
What is the Elon Musk thing? It's the most ironic thing is the thing that happens.
That's the Musk rule?
Welcome to Telltales. I'm Mike Nicoletti. Every week, along with my co-hosts Jason Wallace and Hunt Lawrence, we bring you the cash flow memo. Get it at telltales.us. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to dive deep into energy, technology, and healthcare. So download the memo now and get started.
The following conversation is intended for informational purposes only. You should always do your own work to determine if an investment is suitable for you.
We're going to try to do A, B, and C very, very quickly today. Do chips history or whatever else comes up. Exhibit C, I think the best thing to do on Exhibit C is discuss it next week because I redid these crude supply numbers and I think I'll redo them again this week. What does that mean? We did this round trip, I would say, in oil. I don't think the U.S. will produce 13 million barrels this year. It'll be lower. Russia, interestingly enough, is lower than the 9.8 just from depletion. And Saudi Arabia, I think, will be higher than 9.7. There's still a surplus. There's still 3.5 or 4 million barrels here. And, when price of oil goes to 80 and then jumps back down in the mid-60s, what you're seeing is a risk premium going up and down. And with the ceasefire, the risk premiums come way down. But more on that next week. On natural gas, which is Exhibit D, there is a new column here for estimated 26. Once again, I might do some more work on this, but the dry gas production has held at 106. So I was so afraid by this time it would be some significantly higher number. And so I'm trying to estimate 26. I just bumped it another 2 billion cubic feet a day. You can see in the table right over it, one of the things I think that's happened is with low oil price, there's less growth from the Permian. This is very interesting. In terms of demand, LNG is doing pretty well, but the one that's slowed down is power. Everyone talks about data centers needing power, but turning natural gas into power is definitely slowed down. I mean, it used to go up by about 1.5 Bs per day per year, but now it's going up and up. Well, the estimate for 26 is 0.5 B a day per year. So that storage change keeps coming down. And if you look down at the bottom, $4 is pretty well established. I mean, it's $3.90 as of Thursday a week ago. It's $3.90 and $4.40. And those prices will hold. The oil price, of course, has come down since then. What's happened is that oil price is kind of hung in there at 26, and the price is, this price went to, high 70s, and then the 26 price was still 66, and then it came back to, mid 60s, and the 26 price will up $1 or $2. So, today, which is the cash flow statement for our country, I think I mentioned this last week, but I had a shot at 26 forecast, which has some deficit reduction, but it's not enough. And of course, the bill they're trying to move through the Senate to reconciliation doesn't have enough reduction in spending. So it'll be up to the budget committees in the House. The way that effort's organized, 12 major categories of expenditure, and they have to work on all 12, and then they have to go to the Senate. The problem, we never get to what is called regular way, is that like reconciliation, where you just need that +1, in the Senate to approve anything else, you've got to get 60 votes, and it just doesn't happen. Hope that can be a true concept. We'll see.
Okay, let's take a quick break for a message from Oakcliff Sailing.
Yet another busy week at Oakcliff, moving one rib out that got hurt yesterday, fixing other ribs. When people ask us what happens at Oakcliff on a normal day when it's 100 degrees out, we're in the sail off. Ewan's redoing the slugs on a match 40. The ribs for the Courageous 10 are being attached. We're fixing another match 40 sail. And then we had a Swan 82 run in and ask us to fix their halyard. So what we're doing here on a hot day is training people to be marine industry workers and make a living to feed their habit to go sailing. Everybody here is scholarships, so feel free to contribute.
And now back to the show.
We started on healthcare last week, so we'll take healthcare last. Not a whole bunch went on in terms of page 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We should reverse back to CHIPS history. So, Mike, over to you for our final session or next to final session on CHIPS history.
Okay. Well, last week we touched on some of these topics, but we'll start with Morris Chang and Taiwan Semiconductor. Again, the links we provided last week on Morris Chang are both phenomenal and worth going into depth on. But the high level was prior to 1987, when Morris Chang founded Taiwan Semiconductor as part of a state project, everybody owned their own fabs. And so production was very, well, if you were going to start a chip company, it was capital intensive. And Morris Chang had kind of realized that if we can just specialize in doing the manufacturing, recognizing that labor costs in Taiwan were lower than in other parts of the world, they might be able to build a great company or, build something that would help support the local economy. We'll touch more on Taiwan Semiconductor's impact later on, but it all started in 1987. And if you remember, we talked about the Wintel era, that had sort of taken off by now. And by the late 80s and into the 90s, IBM initially as the main PC maker and Intel as the primary semiconductor, the x86 semiconductor that ran those chips, dominated. I mean, Apple was active at times through this history into the 90s, but never really mounted a serious competitor to the Intel PC. Now, eventually IBM was supplanted or faced a lot of competition because they weren't actually providing anything unique or useful. So they were essentially an assembler of parts. So companies like Compaq and HP and some of the others, they all figured out how to manufacture these computers in the same way. But Intel and x86 remained at the center of this. There was one thing worth mentioning in the late 90s that is distinctive for two different reasons. Jim Keller, whose name we'll talk about more the rest of this semiconductor history process, really was or is a phenomenal chip designer. And AMD hired him to help them design a new x86 chip. And they really timed it well because he came to AMD at a point where they were really struggling and going right into the dot-com bubble. They were able to release what was called the K7 Athlon processor. If you remember right, AMD had a cross-license to all of Intel's IP. So it was a kind of a built-in competitor, but because of the scale dynamics of the industry, AMD wasn't that competitive. They couldn't invest as heavily in their fabs. While they had access to the IP, they couldn't manufacture quite as well to keep up. And they were always kind of a step behind, if you will. Jim Keller sort of changed that in that he designed a very good chip, or led the designs of a very good chip, and implemented some new IP, specifically in the K8 Athlon being the first 64-bit x86 processor. And yes, that was a mouthful of confusing stuff, but the big takeaway is Keller was focused on a performance per watt of power metric. And that would later become way, way, way more important. At this point in time, though, that 64-bit architecture, which was eventually cross-licensed over to Intel, validated that Keller was on to something that was really, really unique. Nonetheless, AMD's attack on Intel didn't last much beyond that. My understanding is they got to close to 50% market share through this era. And then after Keller went away, Intel was able to move ahead. Then the next thing I want to talk about is the shift from mainframe computing to the cloud. But this is kind of before cloud. And I'm going to toss this over to Jason because it's what Jason did during this period. The long story short, though, and I'll tee this up, is that initially you had these big mainframe computers and they were sort of specialized and the software was super specialized. But people figured out that you could just basically link up a bunch of desktop computers and it'd be easier to program that and in some ways more performant than these ultra expensive, super specialized mainframes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
Yeah, they weren't quite desktop computers, but they were they were commodity servers. So this was, I guess, probably the early 2000s when Yahoo at the time was maybe, they might even have more market share than Google. It was Yahoo and Google. Their challenge was really how do we index the internet and serve that up as a search product. It was vast amounts of data, more data than companies were processing otherwise at the time. So kind of the status quo at the time was you spend hundreds of thousands or a couple $1 million on a giant computer that could run the largest Oracle database that you could possibly create and put all your data there. This was one very expensive machine. It was a single point of failure in your system. So what Google and Yahoo both independently did was create this way to distribute the computing. And the idea was you can buy hundreds, thousands of these commodity cheap servers, maybe at a price point of $2,000 each, and then network them with like physical networking and software in a way that they can share the responsibility for computing. And what they were trying to do was crawl the internet and then calculate search indexes for all of that data and then load that, in Google's case, load it into memory so that they could serve it really fast when someone typed in a search query. So at the time, before cloud, big buzzword was big data, distributed computing. That was really the push. And as Mike mentioned, AMD focused on power consumption per CPU, per unit of compute. And that really became a big metric in this era. So if you were running 1,000 servers, your OpEx was the big expense rather than, CapEx of buying the actual hardware. You had to power them and cool them in a data center, and that was the real challenge. And during this era is also when a lot of innovation occurred on how you design data centers in an efficient way so you can, have cooling aisles and hot aisles and really interesting kind of, floor space architecture in a data center.
Which is all being reinvented today.
Right.
Hey, Jason, when did Amazon weigh in? I mean, one of the things I remember that Amazon had extra capacity and they decided when it wasn't the Christmas season where they needed all the capacity, they decided to rent it out. And I think I remember Bezos making commentary saying, you never get a head start. But for the first 2 or 3 years, we didn't know what we were doing. We thought we were just trying to adjust to a seasonal demand for our servers.
Oh, exactly. That was 2006. And if you hosted a shopping site, you had your own servers and you had to have enough capacity to handle Black Friday. Well, was it Cyber Monday back then, right? You had to handle all that capacity or else people were not going to get to your site and not be able to make a purchase. So what that meant is most times in the year, if you weren't having a sale or there wasn't concert tickets going on sale or something, you had extra capacity yourself that was just sitting there, and Amazon was looking at that and saying, how can we generate revenue from these computers that are sitting idly? And initially it was just they let you rent out disk storage space so you could store your files there. And then I don't know if it was quite a year, but a year later they started letting you rent compute capacity so you can control the server and run compute processes there. And then AWS just took off from there. But in the beginning, no one thought this was maybe a real business. It was just a way to get excess revenue from a unused resource.
What was the Google status at that time period? Were they even in business, or how?
Oh yeah,
How did they?
they were the
Their-
dominant search platform. They were taking over from Yahoo. Yahoo invented a lot of the early distributed computing software that was used for those 15 years. But Google really pushed the boundaries on database storage side of that, distributed storage. But they were focusing on gaining share in search. So cloud computing wasn't necessarily a focus of theirs because they were massively growing this search market and advertising there.
Do you think that any of the trends out there, artificial intelligence, stable coins, other kinds of currencies, have the potential to replicate what Amazon was able to do with Amazon Web Services, or Google was able to do with search, or having a kind of a second coming or a third coming of that kind of development? Is that just that's just not likely? 10 or 20 year period. But if we're just looking at the various candidates now, and let's say everyone's probability is pretty low, who would you put? How would you establish who had the best probability of having that kind of winner take all kind of outcome?
Yeah, that's tough to call now. OpenAI certainly has a huge start. They have the customers, and we always talk about if you control the customer, you could control the market. You've got to bring the products to them. You're the gatekeeper. On a technology side, I don't see any of the stuff going on now as kind of the same shift. AI, to me, from a product standpoint, it's going to be a huge change in how software is presented to a user. But behind the scenes, we were talking about machine learning for years and pattern recognition and then language processing. And this is pattern recognition with language and really good algorithms at predicting what words go together given certain inputs. So to me, it's an evolution rather than completely changing the foundation of what you're doing as opposed to one big expensive server into 1,000 smaller compute pieces that are programmed in an entirely different way. Everything's evolutionary. It seems like the blockchain stablecoin stuff is really just a new distributed database. I think it's a lot of hype around what they're doing differently, but maybe the innovation is that there's a trustless architecture, so you don't have to trust the counterparty in a transaction if it's on the blockchain.
Yeah, I think that's the big part of it, right? Like our financial system is 100% built around trust. And if you were to re-architect it as one where you did not have to trust that someone was going to deliver the money the way that you wanted it to, it's actually a decent solution. It's a very good solution.
Was it a problem?
Well, 100%. I think that's the good question. I'm less bearish about it than Jason is, but I think Jason's convinced me that the performance of the database itself as a blockchain is so bad that you could come up with an alternative payment solution that could take a lot of share from the likes of Visa and MasterCard. But
yeah, so the GENIUS Act.
Yeah. So Congress passed the GENIUS Act, which is, well, among other things, makes these stable coins, forces them to hold a certain amount of treasuries in order to match dollar for dollar to ensure that they are actually stable. So it is legitimizing the industry. Did you have more comments on that?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the issuers now today use U.S. Treasuries as the backing. So if you legitimize this, and all the banks are now starting to talk about creating a stable coin of their own, they're going to be big buyers of U.S. Treasuries right at the time we need to start selling a lot of them to finance the deficit spending that we have. So I don't know if that's coincidental.
But that's dollars. In a way, that's dollars that we're really going to set a bank account or something else.
Yeah.
So. Maybe it'll be like Japan. We'll somehow figure out how to finance these deficits internally by just stable coins in circulation. Yeah. Anything else on page 234 before we switch to healthcare?
Robotaxi launched.
Yeah. Yeah, early reports from the Robotaxi launch in Austin are quite good. Netflix signed a deal to broadcast a French TV station. So we've been talking about whether Netflix ends up being, or streaming becomes the new cable. We know that Google has YouTube TV, which works essentially exactly like cable, except over the streaming network. This seems to show that Netflix is interested in expanding its reach a little bit, and this will be a trial for them.
We had a court ruling out of a federal court in California that it was a copyright case brought against Anthropic. And the ruling was that an AI model similar to a person can read books or other copyrighted material and learn from it, and it's not infringement in that case. So big implications across a lot of the big tech and AI companies from that.
I think very positive in that it's not going to, otherwise it's likely these models would have been sued out of existence.
Right. What about Harrow? Is there Harrow news or Lantheus news or Vertex Pharmaceutical news or?
Did we cover the acquisition of the new product?
You did last year.
Yeah, that's right. To recap, they acquired another product for $500,000 that will bolt into their platform quite well. And it's just another one of those Harrow-style deals where it just makes so much sense. Yep. And it was well structured as a win-win for both.
Yep. Otherwise, there's an interesting story brewing with what's been going with HIMSS. HIMSS is maybe the only telehealth platform that was successful and still standing. Last month, they cut a deal with Novo Nordisk to direct-to-consumer sell their GLP-1 drug. Novo said they're terminating that deal and accused HIMSS continuing to promote their compounded version of it rather than selling the name brand, which they have been doing and still have been doing. So really, I think the deal between the two parties was cut to say, rather than selling the compounded version, which has a very gray legality. Yeah, no, you're we think it's illegally being sold.
Yeah. I mean, like, I don't want to sugarcoat it. A lot of people really think HIMSS is this amazing company, and really they've exploited some of the most egregious conflicts of interest in the healthcare industry, and they've completely violated property rights. And like, people look at the CEO like he's some great guy. It's like, I'm completely missing it. And there's prominent value investors. There's lots of people that are really like this company. I don't get it.
I think, and myself included, I want to root for something like this to succeed. This just is not the team to do it or the team to back. But so Novo pulled out of the agreement. They're not going to be able to sell their branded drugs any longer. They're still selling the compounded version, which they claim they can do because they personalize it to each person on their platform. I mean, if you just extend this logic to any drug, they can compound any drug, circumvent the patents, and what happens to innovation? There's no patent protection. There's no incentive to create new, for drug discovery. It's not workable. Otherwise, there's a lot of kind of, regulatory news. I'll try to rip through it pretty quick. CMS announced that or kind of indicated that they're going to implement a rule by the end of this year to require all drug prices to be publicly disclosed. So an effort for transparency. And one thing they're pushing for is the net price paid to be disclosed. So this is what the PBMs are actually paying the pharma company for that drug, that they try to, they try to obscure that as much as possible. HHS announced a plan that includes all the largest insurers. I think something like 280 covered insured lives in the US, 280 million lives, where they're going to push them to have prior authorizations run through an electronic system. So the estimates from physician surveys are a doctor or someone on their team might spend 12 hours a week running through paperwork for prior authorization for procedures. Hopefully this eliminates most of that time spent and gets prior authorization responses back, hopefully same day. So that's big news.
That was a big deal for people that were, especially if they're switching between healthcare providers, which sometimes is not your choice. You'd have to go in and reauthorize. You have to go through the process completely again to get re-diagnosed with whatever it was you were diagnosed with previously, just because you were under a new insurer. So it's going to solve a lot of that kind of stuff.
And then another thing that has implications on a few of these companies we follow is related to advertising. The White House said they're considering a plan to not allow pharmaceutical advertising to be deducted as a business expense for tax purposes. So I think Lilly might be the biggest spender on advertising. What did I write down here? They spend about $1.5 nearly billion a year on marketing. So that's a 300 or plus hit to their tax expense. Regeneron's also a big spender on pharma ads. So that might be the way that they kind of restrict advertising. Don't make it outright illegal, since there's a lot of First Amendment arguments against being able to do that, but make it less financially beneficial.
Interesting.
Jason, do you think that's a regulatory issue or a legislative issue to restrict advertising?
It's a legislative issue. I don't. It's not. It's not related to the efficacy or safety of the drug, or who you can prescribe it to. I don't think it's a FDA kind of regulatory thing.
Yeah. The pharmaceutical companies will lobby like crazy to keep advertising. But I think it's the case, Jason, that there are only 2 countries in the world that have advertising for pharmaceuticals. One is us and one is New Zealand. So it's just not done other places.
Right.
And I think it's also the case that if you pull apart these pharmaceutical companies, they spend as much on advertising and promotion as they spend on R&D. Good. Well, listen, we will, what do we switch to next week? Do we switch to software, Mike and Jason, or I think we made chips a pretty good run?
I don't know. We still got to do the iPhone, and we still haven't talked about GPUs at all. So,
there you go.
We might have one more week. I promise I won't stretch it out. It's just there's so much history, and we sort of skipped a lot of stuff too. But that performance per watt thing with Keller becomes really important as you move into mobile, and then now today in GPUs, energy is such a key. I mean, it's the largest single non-depreciation expense associated with running a data center.
No question. Okay, well, in the interim, everyone be well and stay healthy, and we'll be here exactly 7 days from now. Take care, everyone.
The views expressed on this podcast are the hosts alone and do not constitute an offer to sell or a recommendation to purchase or a solicitation of an offer to buy any security nor a recommendation for any investment product or service. While certain information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, neither the hosts nor any of their employers or their affiliates have independently verified this information, and its accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed. Accordingly, no representation or warranty, expressed or implied, is made as to and no reliance should be placed on the fairness, accuracy, timeliness, or completeness of this information. The hosts and all employers and their affiliated persons assume no liability for this information and no obligation to update the information or analysis contained herein in the future and may or may not hold positions in the securities mentioned.